What's up everybody, and welcome to another video. We're getting a few weeks into our semester now, and so I thought it was a great time for us to talk about assessments. Specifically in this video, we're going to talk about 3 different things when it comes to assessments. We'll begin by talking about just some basic principles for preparing and organizing and evaluating your assessments that you're putting together. The second thing we're going to talk about is different types of assessments and maybe a little bit about what type of assessment to use depending on what you're trying to evaluate. And then finally, we're going to talk about what to assess. So as you're putting together your rubric and your plan for your assessment, how do you know that you're on the right page and that you're going to end your exam or whatever assessment you're doing with some good feedback that you can give to your students. So we're going to begin by talking about 5 basic principles when it comes to assessments. And to me, these are like the must-haves. They're the essentials that no matter what you're doing when it comes to assessment, you've got to have these 5 things. So the first principle when it comes to assessments is you need to ask yourself, is this test valid? And basically there's 2 underlying questions that help you know whether a test is valid. The first question is you need to ask yourself, is this test that I'm giving my students actually evaluating what I'm saying it's evaluating? And then the second question is it evaluating extra things that I'm not actually trying to evaluate? So let me give you an example of that. Imagine that in class you had been teaching your students to identify certain key characteristics within a text or within a passage or video or whatever. But then for your assessment, you told them to summarize a passage. Well, using our Bloom's taxonomy list, we know that identifying something and summarizing are 2 completely different skills, and one is much higher than the other when it comes to the Bloom's taxonomy list. So if we have been working with our students, or our students are at the level where the best that they can do in the language is identify, then maybe we need to have an assessment where they're doing multiple choice tests, or they're doing something where they circle or underline or actually just identify. However, if we're dealing with some upper level students who maybe are more proficient in the language, then maybe they should be doing tasks such as summarizing or producing or even creating. And this would mean that they wouldn't be taking as many multiple choice tests where they're just circling the right answer that they see in a blank. Another thing to recognize with foreign language students is that sometimes the students are not actually struggling with the task itself, but they're struggling with the instructions or maybe like the pre-setup to the task. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine that you have students like watch a video and then they've got to like write a report on the video or answer questions about the video or whatever else, however you're evaluating. Well, if the student gets a question wrong or they mis-summarize the video, there's a lot that went into that task. It could be that they struggled with writing. It could be that they struggled with organizing and clarifying their ideas, but it also could be that they didn't understand the video because the person in the video was talking too fast. And so if you're trying to evaluate someone's writing skills, but you're doing it based on their ability to read and comprehend, then you're kind of doing 2 things at one time, and that just makes things way more complicated. And so what you're going to really want to do is to make sure that your test is valid, meaning that it's only evaluating what you are intentionally trying to evaluate. The second principle you're going to want to know when it comes to assessments is that your assessments should be reliable. And what this means is that no matter if you're the one grading the exam or someone else is grading the exam or 100 different students take the exam, if they do the same work, they should be able to get the same grade. And this is something that I always struggled with in English class because it always felt like English was just so subjective. Like, why should a teacher take off this many points for punctuation but only this many points for content? And I always struggled with different conversations like that. But now that I actually am an English teacher, I can see some of the difficulty in consistently giving reliable assessments to my students. And so in my mind, there's kind of 2 big things that you need to do in order to have more consistent and more reliable assessments. And those are, you need to give clear instructions on the front end, and then you also need to have a clear rubric and picture of success on the back end. And so let me give you some examples of how those 2 things work together. First off, with the clear instructions. Imagine that I just told you to write a paragraph about anything that you like, or to talk to me for 1 minute about your family. Okay, there's all sorts of things that you can do in that 1 minute or in that paragraph that you write. And so if I am evaluating you on very specific criteria, but I give you so much freedom to just roam around and do what you want during your time of speaking or writing, then it's really unfair to you because you don't know like what I'm actually asking for. The same thing happens on the back end. I saw a really good example from a teacher that imagine I was just holding an apple right now in front of you, and I ask you to tell me like how would you grade this apple on a scale of 1 to 10? Okay, some of you might say, wow, that's a 10 out of 10. That is a beautiful apple. Others of you might say like, I'd say maybe 5 or 6. One of you might say, oh, that's a 2. But without like a clear rubric, all of those numbers are just kind of arbitrary. Okay, they're made up based on your own, I guess, internal logic. But as we can begin to clarify the rubric, so maybe we talk about just specifically like the color of the apple, the texture, the taste of the apple. And then we give grades for like what would be an ideal color, what would be an ideal texture, an ideal taste, and then what would be like slightly less ideal versions of that. The more I could give you a specific and clear rubric, the more all of our grades for that apple will begin to look more and more similar. And so this is why the clearer your rubric, the more consistently you're going to be able to grade your students. Or if for some reason someone else graded your students, they should be able to grade it pretty similarly to how you did it. That's really what it means to have a reliable assessment. The third principle that is really important for assessments, and this is especially true for online assessments, is that they need to be practical. This means that you need to be able to feasibly administer them and grade them within the time space that you have. And it also means that your students need to feasibly be able to actually perform the assessments without like just spending tons and tons of time or going and having to buy a lot of resources that they don't currently own. I think this one's pretty self-explanatory, but take some time to think practically about what can my students do in a limited amount of time? And then also as a teacher, what do I have the capacity to grade and give good feedback on? The fourth principle that you're gonna wanna take into consideration, again, especially when we're teaching online, is actually pretty similar to principle number 3, and that is that your assessment should be accessible. This applies a lot in the States if you're dealing with like students that have special needs or some sort of disability or different things like that, making sure that your assessments are accessible. But also when we're teaching online to students like in China, they should be able to upload their videos or download the instructions or have access to the rubrics. Your assessment shouldn't be on some sort of platform that's blocked in another country. Different things like that. Just make sure that your assessments are accessible. And finally, principle number 5 is it's just great when your assessments are authentic. So this means that they're contextualized in some way. They have some meaning, some impact, some purpose or reason that you might apply in an everyday life kind of situation. So this means that it's more than just a multiple choice test or like a fill in the blank answer. Especially whenever we're talking about speaking within like a foreign language context, I think that students do so much better whenever we move past like just this abstract conversation that we want them to have with a partner into maybe something more specific. So like, let's say they're just talking about like their hometown or something like that. You could tell them, just tell your partner 3 things about your hometown. But you could give them a little bit of context and say like, imagine that someone just moved into your hometown and they have no idea where they should go for lunch. Tell them your top 3 recommendations and give a reason why for each place. All of a sudden, you're gonna get like way better feedback on that question, and also like the students are gonna have more motivation to answer it because we move past just like this abstract school type talk into a conversation that they might actually have with someone. And so having authentic assessments and authentic tasks for the students to do, I think builds a lot of motivation, but also just lets the students give way better answers than they would otherwise. So when it comes to giving assessments to foreign language students, I found that there's quite a few options that you can do, and people have thought of all kinds of amazing ideas, but most of the ideas fall into 3 big categories. They're either presentational speeches, they're interpersonal communication, or some sort of interpretive listening activity. So these interpretive ones are maybe like the students watch a video, they listen to something, they read something, and then they like do a multiple choice test that's kind of like testing their comprehension, or maybe they do a fill in the blank or a summary, something like that. But it's all interpretive based on like this content that they just consumed. The interpersonal is where I would say we camp out the most in our class, like just day to day. So this is like talking to a partner, the ability to like communicate in a group, or even like having an interview where I interview the students or the student interviews me, and we just work on like asking and answering questions and kind of having like that back and forth dialogue like the student's going to have in their real life someday. And then finally, we have presentational speeches, and this could be like an actual speech like you think of. We could do some sort of debate, or we could do something like a PowerPoint presentation, or I've had my students like create different little objects or bring in pictures and things like this that then they present to the class. And of course, they could do this in front of the whole class. They could do it in front of a small group, whatever. But those are kind of the three main types of assessments. It's presentational speeches, interpersonal communication, and then interpretive assessments. So no matter what type of assessment you choose within those three broad categories, there's always going to be like English skills and English abilities that you're going to want to be able to evaluate. And then typically there's also like some content and some like following directions skills that you're going to want to evaluate. Or maybe it's like the skills that you've been working on during your unit. And so what I want to do is just kind of walk you through one of my rubrics and show how I evaluate both like the English skills as well as like the content and ability to follow directions and actually perform the task. So when it comes to evaluating my students' speaking ability, there's typically 5 things that I look for. And those 5 things are the student's fluency, their vocabulary, their grammar, their pronunciation, and then their overall content and organization. And sometimes if content is a really big part of the project, then I will make a few more separate categories specifically talking about the content. For time's sake, I'm not going to go into too much detail about how I break down all 5 of those categories, but I do kind of want to give you just like a general overview of them. So in fluency, I'm looking for if the students are able to speak for a sustained period of time, and also if they're able to speak like without much hesitation. Are they searching for words, like trying to translate in their mind, or are they able to like kind of just speak naturally and how they want to? For vocabulary, I'm really looking at how wide of a range in vocabulary they have, and also like how precise their vocabulary is. Are they able to communicate what they want to say like precisely and concisely, or are they kind of like beating around the bush because they don't really have the words that they want to say? For grammar, I'm not expecting my students to be perfect, but I also don't want their grammar to distract from the meaning that they're trying to get across. And so a few things that I found that can distract from meaning is whenever they mess up he, she, especially in Chinese. The other thing is when they get their tenses wrong and they're going back and forth, past, present, future, all the different tenses, and it's just mixing together and it's not right. And then with that is subject-verb agreement. So I tend to kind of camp out on those 3 things. The next category is pronunciation. And in my humble opinion, I think that you can really only grade this one as harshly as you teach it. So in my class, I do try to work with my students some on their intonation and their word stress, and then a few key sounds that I know like many different Chinese students struggle with. But I'm not going over IPA charts with my students, and I'm not like just having a large amount of time dedicated to class, because that's not what my specific class is about. I'm much more like fluency oriented. And so I will dock some points on students for their pronunciation when I think it distracts from the meaning or when it's just really hard to understand them. So I try to give them specific feedback on pronunciation so that I'm not like hurting their feelings and making them feel like they can't speak English, but also that they can know like a few of the things that they can work on to just be easier to be understood. And then finally, I told you that the 5th thing that I look for when it comes to like ESL speaking skills is just how well did they develop the content that I asked them to talk about, and with that, how well did they organize it? And this might not sound like a specific English skill, but a huge part of communication is being able to like organize content in a way that it flows well, that it transitions well, that you connect even like different ideas and contrasting ideas. And so I really care that my students are able to like deliver content in a way that's understandable and just like makes sense and is persuasive. And so I've added that as a part of my rubric. I also mentioned to you that sometimes I take this content section of the rubric and I divide it out into even more categories, because I'm not just testing the students' English speaking skills. I'm usually also testing them on like how well can they follow directions and how well can they use the skills that we've been working on in our unit. And that's what I would recommend to you on your exams as well, is that you take some skills, take some topics from your class, but find ways that your students can apply them differently, but also in a way that's like authentic and kind of cool. And I think you're going to get a lot of positive feedback when you do that. And so speaking about feedback, a video about assessments just wouldn't be complete without mentioning it. Guys, I think that feedback is one of the most important things that you can give your students. Way more than actually the grade they get is having some feedback directly from you. And so there's all kinds of ways to do this. I found that teaching the size classes that I teach, it's much easier to use a learning management system like Schoology or something like that, and just be able to click through a rubric and give them feedback on the rubric. The more precise and well-worded my rubric is, the more information they're actually going to get from it. So I found that's really helpful. I've also found that I find myself typing the same comments to students over and over and over. And so if you do that, maybe it would be helpful for you to start a Word document or a notes page and to just type out some of the little comments that you tend to respond to students with, and just copy and paste them right into your rubric rather than retyping them every time. That's super helpful. If you have time to give face-to-face feedback or even video recorded feedback or something like that to your students, that's awesome. What I would recommend though is just don't just give them an 87. Take some time, think about how am I going to evaluate this and how am I going to give them good feedback that they can learn and they can grow from. Anyway, that's all for today's video. I hope that you found this conversation about assessments and feedback and everything we discussed today helpful, and that you can apply it as you're planning your different exams and your assessments for your class. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to leave a comment down below, because I really want to learn from you, and I can't wait to see you in the next video. Bye, guys.